Hello, everyone. Now we are going to begin discussing Chapter 18, which covers managing challenging behaviors. And I'm sure this is a topic that a lot of us need guidance on because that can be one of the most challenging things, not only of working with young children in a classroom setting, but also of parenting. So hopefully you will get a lot out of Chapter 18, Managing Challenging Behaviors. Here are our objectives for Chapter 18. After reading this chapter, you should be able to describe developmentally appropriate behavior problems, explain the factors that determine whether behavior problems require special attention, because remember, some behavior problems are normal developmentally and expected and demonstrate typical behavior. Number 2, describe the teaching pyramid, which is a tiered model for supporting social competence and preventing challenging behaviors in young children. 3, identify the steps to completing a functional behavior plan. 4, choose an appropriate data collection method to monitor a child's behavior. And finally, list behavior problems common to early childhood settings and strategies for preventing and reducing these behaviors. So remember, think about what you already know about these topics. A lot of us probably have some prior knowledge with managing challenging behaviors. So first, before diving into the chapter, think about what you already know, activate your prior knowledge, that schema in your brain. And as you go through the chapter and you're going to elaborate on these topics, you will be able to clarify misconceptions. You will be able to clarify confusions and extend on your prior knowledge. So this will help you to retain the information and move it from your short-term working memory into your long-term memory. So again, this is a great tip strategy related to information processing. Don't just dive into reading. You need to frame your thinking and have a purpose for reading. So once you've done that, you're ready to move on. When is a behavior a problem? Most children, and adults for that matter, exhibit mood swings. Most children have had at least one tantrum, and many of us who have children or who have raised young children or who have worked with young children probably say one is a pretty big understatement. But according to the text, most children have had at least one tantrum, and children have off days, again, just like adults. So think about young children that we work with, their prefrontal cortex, sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied today. Their prefrontal cortex isn't quite developed, and so their self-regulation is still working. And so they're trying to figure out how to regulate emotions, how to determine how to articulate feelings, and how to manage behaviors and emotions in challenging situations. And so it makes sense that children are going to have off days. And normal deviations can become fixed patterns when they get the adult attention. So this is where that magic comes in, where you have to kind of figure out the balance between when is it necessary to address a problem and when does addressing a problem actually reinforce the behavior. So you have to kind of figure out that middle ground, and that's where the artistry comes in. Also think about temperament. There is goodness of fit. Caregivers and children need to fit each other. And I think this is something that we don't necessarily always talk about. So just like children have off days and multiple personalities and dispositions and temperaments, so do adults. And so sometimes certain adult personalities and temperaments don't necessarily match with the temperament and personalities of certain kids. And so that's okay to understand. But I think when you first acknowledge it, then you're more likely to be able to address it. Active children need caregivers who respect and appreciate the child's need to move. So again, thinking about your own goodness of fit. This is something that we talk about in education in general, and just if you're going to pursue a career in education, is there a goodness of fit? So in other words, is this a career path that lends itself to the type of personality that you have? And again, there's a wide range of personalities that make great teachers, but you have to determine if you fit into one of those categories. Quiet children need a caregiver who understands their need for more one-on-one time. And again, going back to this idea of goodness of fit, I personally think that while there are personality types that maybe are a better fit for kids, there is a level of adaptation that adults can make. So For example, with certain kids who maybe need a little bit more calm and quiet and tranquility, an adult might be able to modify and adapt their behavior to match that child's disposition. And then that same adult who's working with a child who maybe has more energy and is more spirited, likes to move around a lot, that adult can adapt their behavior and their temperament to match that child. And I think honestly, that's what a lot of adults do, whether you're working with kids in a classroom setting or if you're a parent. I think we tend to try to meet children where they are and then adapt ourselves to what's going to be best to support that child's development. But again, back to goodness of fit, if that proves too difficult, then that's when an adult would have to reevaluate if they do in fact have the goodness of fit to be able to manage all of the different beautiful complexities that is young children. So again, talking about when behavior is too much, how much is too much? So this is again that kind of where science and art meet. So how do we know when it's too much? What might be too much for one caregiver or school setting or child might not be necessarily too much for another. So occasional outbursts, according to the text, are not a concern. Again, it's within the realm of normal behavior. Behaviors that increase in intensity, so they escalate, then those maybe warrant a second look. How much is too much of a behavior? So we need to think about frequency too, not just intensity level increasing, but frequency or how often they're happening. So with all of these great questions, observation is the key. And that's not something that I think comes to mind when we first think about behavior problems. We think about we need to act on them, we need to nip them in the bud. We need to make sure that children know what's right from wrong. We need to make sure that children are safe. And all of those are in fact true and important. But I think the textbook brings up an important point, that observation is the key. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail to discover why that is and how to carry out these observations that are going to help us manage challenging behaviors. There is a concept called a tiered framework for intervention. So first, that starts with building positive relationships. Very, very important in working with children and adults for that matter. Building positive relationships should be at the core of our work. Thinking about preventative classroom interventions. Again, this is important. We don't want to always be reactionary and always acting after something has occurred, but we want to work to prevent the behaviors from occurring in the first place. Social emotional teaching strategies are also very important. We have to think about the child as a whole person, not just the cognitive aspect. So we start from here and going down. So we have the cognitive, we have the social emotional, we have the physical, etc. So we want to make sure that we're not just focusing on one area like just the cognitive, but they're a whole child. They've got the heart, they have their emotions, they have their brain, they have the physicality, they have their language and the linguistic development aspect too. So that's an important concept to think about, is looking at children as a whole child. So social emotional is a big part of that. Planning intensive individualized interventions is important. One of the things that we talk about in child development is that, number one, every child is unique. Number two, every caregiver is unique. Number three, every situation is unique. So with all of these variations, it's very important that we think about how do we address this individual situation in a way that's best for those involved in this unique situation, for this unique child with this unique caregiver. So something important to keep in mind. A tiered framework for intervention also includes designing intervention. So positive behavior support is important. So number one, you need to identify what the behavior is, identify the settings in which it occurs, and design interventions with which all team members are comfortable. So think about if you take a look at this artist here, it's all about perspective, right? So if you take a look at this little one who is making her piece of art on the wall, what is the behavior? What's the problem behavior that we're seeing here? And is it a problem? So if we're going to identify the behavior, what are we indicating is the problem? Identify the setting in which it occurs. So when is this artistry writing on the wall happening? And then if we were working with our team members, what are some interventions that we would create so that everyone feels comfortable with the process and the outcome? Because again, if we're not all on board, then we're less likely to consistently implement them. A functional approach to managing problem behaviors. So in this approach, you need to first examine the environment. And this is why developmentally appropriate practices are so important, and the environment is a big part of that. Examine your own behavior. So this is when we have to look at the man in the mirror. What are some things that we are doing as caregivers, the adults in the classroom, that might be either reinforcing negative behaviors or, children are looking to us. We're modeling appropriate behaviors, etc. So what are some things that we're doing or not doing that could possibly be contributing to the problem behaviors? And then use a functional behavior assessment. So we are determining what the behaviors are. We're looking at antecedents, which is what are some issues that are occurring before the behavior occurs, and then how are we responding? Is our response reinforcing the behavior, etc. So here is a little bit more detail about the steps to a functional behavior assessment. So first, you identify the problem situation. So what is the issue that is problematic in each scenario? Then assess the child and the environment. So what is going on with the child? What is going on with the environment? Then specify an objective for the intervention. So what is it our goal to do or to accomplish? What is it that we want to see the child do? What is it that we need to possibly change in the environment? What is it that we possibly need to address with the caregiver in the situation? And then we address the function of the behavior. We identify a replacement behavior, and then we plan the intervention. So assessing the function of the behavior essentially is, well, what purpose is the behavior solving? So if a child is drawing on the wall, is it boredom? If a child is yelling, is it because they don't have the words to express what their needs are? If they are snatching toys that maybe another child is playing with, is it because there are not enough materials available for all children to have? So thinking about the function of the behavior, because believe it or not, even with behaviors that we find undesirable or what we would consider, challenging behaviors, there's a function, there's a purpose. There's a purpose that the child is seeking out by exhibiting that particular behavior. So I think that's a really important piece of our functional behavior assessment, is to determine the function of the behavior. Implement the plan and ensure that it is carried out as planned. So that's an important piece too, is the consistency in the implementation. Monitor the child's progress and continue to monitor implementation. So here you see an example of a multiple behavior chart. So it's divided by days of the week, and then we have different behaviors or actions that you want the child to fulfill, and then you tally them up, and you might have specific goal numbers that you're working with the child on, and maybe you're working towards some sort of a goal to reinforce when the child meets that goal. So that's just one example. Data collection and progress monitoring. There are different types of data collection, because remember we discussed in the beginning that it's important when we're looking at challenging behaviors to observe. So if you're going to observe, it's really important to have some sort of a data collection method in place so that you can assess what it is that you're observing. So having that data is really helpful at coming up with a solution. So looking at frequency is one. Is number of times that the behavior occurs. So you might look at it in a specific amount of time, or over a week. It might be within an hour, depending on the behavior and how frequently it's occurring might be the increments that you're going to look at. And then also we want to know the the interval. So for the interval, that's breaking the day up into intervals and then evaluating when the behavior occurs. I skipped duration. So yes, duration is how long each episode occurs. Frequency, number of times. Duration is how long each episode occurs. So if they're having screaming fits or tantrums, writing on the wall like in the previous slide, how long is each episode occurring? And then finally we have the interval, which is the breaking the day up into intervals and evaluating when the behavior occurs. So types of data collection, we have frequency, then duration, then interval, and they can each be used for different purposes. So when you're collecting the data, you want to record a baseline. So this would be like your control group, sort of, if you're doing an experiment or a study. So the baseline would be, how do you establish what the norm is? So this is when you observe the child 3 to 5 days before the intervention to determine what is normal for that child. You can use your frequency methods, duration methods, and or interval methods for your data collection. And when you're going through the process of recording the baseline 3 to 5 days before the intervention. So what are some common behaviors and solutions? I'm sure that we could cover up this slide and you all could probably give me some pretty on point ideas for what are common behaviors and some proposed solutions. So aggressiveness is one, and that is comprised of conflict. So seeing what triggers the behavior is one way to help bring it down. So that's one solution for aggressiveness, is first see what triggers the behavior. And it seems like that's common sense, right? Sometimes when you're in the moment and you've got lots of little ones that you're managing, then sometimes it's hard to do. So with managing aggressiveness, you're watching for the triggers, what is causing the aggressive behavior. You're eliminating those triggers to the extent possible, and then teaching appropriate responses to emotion. So I think that's really important. So I think one behavioral thing that I've learned as a parent and as, working with children is that it's much better to tell children what you want them to do versus what you don't want them to do. So instead of saying, don't run, you might say, everyone, let's walk carefully. Let's walk slowly. So giving children a directive of what you want them to do is a much more effective approach than telling them what not to do. I think about when my 7-year-old son Noah was little and we were at Kaiser and we were looking at a water fountain, and I told him, I said, Noah, don't throw your pacifier in the fountain, because at that time he always had his little binky with him. And what do you think was the first thing he did? Threw the pacifier in the fountain. Told him not to do it, but all he's hearing is throw pacifier into the fountain. I'm telling him what not to do. Instead, tell children what you want them to do. So that is related to teaching appropriate responses to emotions. So if you're getting on a child or you're reprimanding and you're trying to indicate, you can't get angry or you shouldn't hit, then instead redirect them by telling them what you want them to do. So take a deep breath, for example. Tell an adult, use your words. All of those things are ways to teach children appropriate responses to their emotions. Also, there are disruptive and destructive behaviors. So they're often at the root of this is the need for attention. Challenging behavior gains attention. So I think a lot of us probably realize this, but it's helpful to remind us that sometimes children would rather have negative attention than what they perceive as no attention at all. So challenging behavior does in fact get attention. And it's hard to ignore. So sometimes, some behavior approaches will say you ignore the negative behavior and eventually it will extinguish the behavior. Well, what if the negative behavior is, hurting oneself or another, or it's defacing property? It's really hard to ignore behavior, nor would I necessarily say that that's the best way to go. So it's, again, finding that middle ground. Mastering routines. So sometimes outbursts occur, disruptive and destructive behavior occur because the child does not understand or has not yet mastered classroom routine. So that's something that you can work towards. Redirection, love redirection, one of my favorite ways to quell challenging behaviors and classroom management and parenting. Gentle reminders of expected behavior. Timeout, break the pattern of responses. So sometimes kids need a break. And so that helps take a step back, take a break, do something different, reflect, redirect, and sometimes then they can kind of recharge or reset themselves. Non-compliance, that's the no, I'm not going to listen to you. Some prevention strategies might be advance warning, so letting them know ahead of time what the expectation is. Reduce overload. Sometimes non-compliance is because the child is just overstimulated and just overwhelmed. Make requests and give directions clearly and briefly. Provide choices. Choices, I think, are one of the most effective ways, because it's very motivating when you give children options. Even if you're coming up with the choices themselves, the child still feels like they have a say in the matter. And beware of choices that are not choices. So think about if you pick up a child from school and you say, hey, are you ready to go home? Sounds like a choice. So you're saying that if I'm not ready to go home, I can stay in school. So those are those weird types of questions that we ask when they're really not choices, because, looking at the time, we have to go home. So there's not a choice, but we say it as though there is a choice. So being cognizant of our language and not offering choices that are not really in fact choices, and focusing the child's attention. So that's helpful in issues that may lead to non-compliance. Allow the child time to comply. So if we're asking a child to change or modify a behavior, to regulate their emotions, etc., then we need to give them time to do it. Practice consistency and firmness. Really, really important. Consistency and firmness. We need to practice doing it. It's hard because we get busy. So practice consistency and firmness, I think, is really important for the adult in the situation as well. And then make sound judgments. Making sound judgments is also vital to helping addressing behavior problems and coming up with solutions. Temper tantrums. Woo-hoo. So with temper tantrums, that is a child's try at control over adults. Yes. So that is the secret of the universe, right? Why are children tantruming? Well, there can be multiple reasons, but ultimately the text says that it's a child's way of trying to control. They're testing their boundaries. They're frustrated, again, that emotional regulation sometimes isn't completely developed. They're trying to communicate something. Children learn that they need to tantrum longer to break down the adult. So that's a tough one, right? Because oftentimes a child will see that the longer they tantrum, it's like a game of chicken, right? The longer that they tantrum, eventually the adult will give in, especially if you're in a public place, right? So that is another reminder to try to be consistent and firm. So for management of tantrums, here are some things to keep in mind. Consistency, safety, and identifying the underlying causes. Is it because the child is hungry? The child is bored? The child is in a situation where they're overstimulated? If you're in a supermarket or if you're in a toy store and the child is seeing all of these amazing things that they want, and then you're telling them, no, you can't have it. Thinking about, a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child, and on top of that, a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child who may have an exceptionality, who has special needs. On top of that, think about how difficult that is. Think about how difficult that is for adults to be able to want something that you can't have and someone else is telling you that you can't have it. So sometimes we really have to really think about what it's like in the mind or in the shoes of a little one, and how difficult it is for them to be able to manage all of these things and navigate the world around them. Separation problems is something else to consider as well. Children experience separation problems as a developmental milestone. So again, this is typical, normal, absolutely okay behavior at a point. Consistency in routines and caregivers is important, and so this is going to help with separation. It will pass. Yes, this too shall pass, the separation anxiety, but children need to know that they can trust what is in their environment. And so that is another reason why consistency in routine and caregivers is important, because if a child develops trust in their caregiver and in the environment, and then that continually is changing, then it's hard for them to establish that trust. They need that predictability and that constant routine. Overdependence. The little girl there. So children are clingy to a teacher or parent. The teacher needs to walk a fine line. So this is another one of those tricky situations where if the child who maybe has a clingy temperament, if they're getting too little attention, then they feel rejected, and that can lead to problems. And if there's too much attention, then that's almost reinforcing the behavior, and then the child's behavior or clinginess increases. So thinking about too little attention, the child feels rejected, then it leads into our next slide, which is withdrawal. It could possibly be an effect of a child who's clingy not getting their needs met. So withdrawn children do not draw the teacher's attention. And that's important to keep in mind. So, we say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So it's the child who is, disruptive or super clingy. Those are the ones that tend to get the teacher's attention. But what about, little Taylor in the corner who is withdrawn and who's quiet, maybe in the corner, maybe with their head down, maybe not speaking. And unfortunately, they don't draw the teacher's attention. Sometimes it might go unaddressed for a while because it doesn't seem to be a big problem in the sense that it's not disruptive. They can retreat even further from social situations in that situation. So it's important to kind of be mindful of all the different temperaments of children that you're working with. So here are some questions to ask. Does the child engage in activities? Do the materials interest the child? Does the child spend time watching other children? Is the child likely to leave an activity if certain children approach? And does the child play close to some children? So these are some good questions to ask when you're trying to evaluate or assess temperament and potential behavior problems in children that you're working with. Inability to share. So to aid children in learning this skill, and something to keep in mind is children who are 2 and 3, they should not be expected to share. And I think that's why child development is so important, because oftentimes we expect things of children that they are not yet developmentally ready to do. So a child who is 2 or 3, they're still very egocentric. So the idea of sharing is pretty difficult for them. I mean, yeah, it's for some adults, right? But we need to try to meet children where they are and provide situations where we are meeting them at their developmental level. So sharing is not necessarily something that is a reasonable expectation for little ones. So in order to aid children in sharing when they're ready to do so, provide multiples of material. So not just one truck, not just one toy kitchen, not just one dress in the dress-up area. Interest center should be attractive, and encourage a game-like atmosphere so that they're collectively playing and working together. The family's involvement is a central role in addressing challenging behavior, so getting family members on board. Culture influences differences in agreement about what is considered a challenge or a problem behavior. So that's important to keep in mind too when working with different families, making sure that you're being culturally responsive to their ideas of what's considered a challenge or a problem behavior, while still also reinforcing and communicating what the expectations are in the classroom or school setting. All right, so we've covered a lot in this chapter. So here are the objectives once again. So after you have read this chapter, you should hopefully now be able to describe developmentally appropriate behavior problems, explain the factors that determine whether behavior problems require special attention, describe the teaching pyramid, a tiered model for supporting social competence and preventing challenging behavior in young children, identify the steps to completing a functional behavior plan, choose an appropriate data collection method to monitor a child's behavior, and list behavior problems common to early childhood settings and strategies for preventing and reducing these behaviors. So hopefully now you're able to more thoroughly address these different objectives since you've gone through the chapter. So see you next time. Thanks again.